Prince and the Sanyasi. Preface. This is a book of narrative history. Its subject is an unusual trial that created a sensation in Bengal in the 1930s, enough to be noticed and written about in many other parts of India. The trial involved a prominent landed family of eastern Bengal, now Bangladesh. It entangled in its enormous net doctors and bureaucrats, priests and prostitutes, soldiers and artists, professors and holy men, besides hundreds of peasants, not to speak of lawyers and judges. The witnesses came not only from Bengal but also from places as far as Nepal and Punjab, and included large number of Europeans, mostly Scotsmen and Englishmen, who were part of the white expatriate community that still dominated the governing institutions of late colonial Bengal. The crucial event whose reconstruction formed the core of the dispute in court had taken place in 1909, and the judicial processes of trial and appeals was completed in 1946. My history of the trial is thus set against the background of the larger history of Bengal in the first half of the 20th century. This is also a book about narrative history, following upon the valiant labors of at least three generations of historians to reform their craft in order to supply the academic marketplace with products that will match the analytically more rigorous but rhetorically simpler standards of the social sciences. The wheel appears to have turned full circle in the last couple of decades. Historians are now persuaded by the arguments of critics such as Hayden White or Mikhail de Cartio. They know they are fooling themselves by pretending to be innocent about the role of rhetoric in even the most analytical historical prose. This newfound self awareness curiously has lulled some into a lazy skepticism that refuses to see any distinction between history and fiction. History writing, they say, is an activity akin to and of the same species as fiction writing because, like the latter, it relies on the power of rhetoric to produce the effect of truth. Of recent historians, Carlo Ginzburg has attempted most vigorously to re-establish the use by historians of proof as opposed to rhetoric and to reassert the claim of history to knowledge as distinct from representation. He does not do this in a spirit of naive and obstinate positivism. Rather, he is concerned to mark out a ground on which the historian could, in a self conscious practice of his or her trade, persuade rather than fool the reader to accept the truthfulness of the account by using methods that are not the same as those of the novelist. In particular, Ginsberg has often compared the methods of the historian with those of the detective and the judge. All three take on the job of finding the truth, and having done so, are required by an appropriate exposition to prove their case. I will have occasion in this book to comment on Gisberg's argument, which I do not fully accept. But more prominently, I will need to compare the judicial with the historical method of arriving at a true reconstruction of past events. The judges in the Bhawal Sanyasi case were faced with the problem familiar to historians of deciding which of the conflicting accounts presented before them represented the truth. Can the historian judge the judges? Could I, more than half a century after the lords delivered their final judgment in London, agree to hear the arguments all over again and act as it were as another court of appeal? Ginsburg will say yes, and I will not disagree. To facilitate such a hearing and in the spirit of an impartial evaluator of evidence, I have reduced the authorial interventions in my narrative to a minimum. The story here is reconstructed entirely out of information that can be attributed to definite sources. All gaps in information have been left unfilled, and speculative remarks have been appropriately flagged. All of the basic rules of positivist historiography, I dare say, have been scrupulously respected. The result I hope to show is a narrative in which the truth turns out to be undecidable. To anticipate a question that I know will be asked of me by every reader, let me say at the beginning that after having spent more than 4 years working through the massive records of the Bhawal case, and although three courts of law ruled in favor of the plaintiff, I remain an agnostic. I do not know if the sannyasi who appeared in Dhaka in 1921 was in fact the second Kumar of Bhawal, who, as far as we know, at that time had died in Darjeeling in 1909. I say this after having applied to the evidence all the tests of truth that I know, and after having evaluated in as reasonable and transparent a manner as I can the procedures adopted by the judges of the three courts who heard the case. This predicament of being left without the truth is, I feel, directly attributable to my methods. Had I been writing a novel based on the Bhawal case, I would have had greater freedom to construct a more consistent plot and a more satisfactory conclusion to the story. On the other hand, I feel greatly relieved not to be in the position of the judge. Unlike the historian, he does not have the luxury of indulging in irony. He must pronounce whether or not the case has been proved. My story also addresses the philosophical problem of identity, but not in the hypothetical mode preferred by analytical philosophers. Rather, it confronts the abstract universalisms of philosophical analysis with the narrative density of a true story. In the course of this encounter, I will at times come close to affirming the radical plea of a philosopher such as Derek Parfit, who asserts, contrary to a ordinary, culturally formed common sense, that identity does not matter. At other times, though, I will need to acknowledge the enormous power of governmental technologies to mold, categorize, and authenticate our identities. The truth of identity in my story is not just a matter of philosophical inquiry but of forensic knowledge. The courts had to determine whether or not the plaintiff was the person he claimed to be. I will thus find it necessary to match the analytical criteria suggested by philosophers against a cultural history of truth. This story deals with relatively unimportant historical characters who do not usually merit much individual attention from professional historians. Although the Bhawal case was widely written about by journalists, pamphleteers, and bazaar writers, this is the first full-length book of academic history to deal with the case. However, there are certain larger historical processes that are sure to be at work in the particular progression of my story. The twin processes of nationalism and decolonization are especially important. I hope to demonstrate that the historical event of the transfer of power from British India to the two sovereign states of India and Pakistan, which is usually treated in political history as the result of constitutional negotiations between British officials and the Indian political leaders during and immediately after World War II, actually has a secret history within the organs of the colonial state. The decade leading up to the war was one in which a generation of Indian practitioners of the art of government, in this case of the administration of justice, had fully worked out the discursive and institutional premises of national self-governance. The Bhawal case, I argue, was resolved the way it was because it became caught up in this secret history of nationalism and decolonization. I will also have occasion to point out the ideological limits of this nationalist construction of the task of self government. In particular, the limits of gender and class are important for my story. The Bhawal case provoked a large popular literature in the 1920s and 30s that took up a completely different perspective from that of the judges. In addition, my story is peopled by several women who played roles quite different from those depicted in the judicial discourse. These provide alternative perspective outside the domain of the elite and of the law, from which the story can be told. Faced with the facts of the momentous consequences on individual lives of the decisions of governmental authorities, the historian cannot, I agree, remain indifferent to the question of the truth. Whether he can always find it is, of course, another matter. Although I have seen most of the 26 volumes of evidence of the Bhawal Sanyasi trial, of which exactly 20 copies were printed before the hearings in the High Court, I was unable to copy them or consult them at leisure. Fortunately, the trial was exhaustively reported in the Bengal press. The Amrita Bazar Patrika, in particular, carried 3 or more broadsheets, more than 20 full columns of reports on each day's hearings. These are available in the newspaper reading room of the National Library in Calcutta. I supplemented these with reports from the Statesman of Calcutta and from the Dhaka Prakash, preserved in the University of Dhaka Library. Full texts of the judgments delivered in the Dhaka District Court and the Calcutta High Court were published at the time. The pavement bookstores on College Street in Calcutta are still a gold mine for such rarities. I found the largest collection of pamphlets on the Bhawal Sanyasi affair in London, in the India Office collection of the British Library. The official archives, however, did not yield much. The Court of Wards had collected all relevant papers relating to the administration of the Bhawal estate for the use of its lawyers, and some of these papers were produced in courts. The files that did not reach the lawyers, fortunately, have now been brought together in a special collection of the National Archives of Bangladesh. The photographs included in this book were either among the exhibits in the Dhaka trial in 1933-1936 or published along with the judgments of the Calcutta High Court in 1940 and are in the public domain. In the course of working on this book, I have received the generous help of many people in many parts of the world. In Dhaka, Dr. Sharifuddin Ahmad and Mir Fazil Chaudhry guided me through the holdings of the National Archives of Bangladesh and Mayazuddin through the University of Dhaka Library. Mamun Roor Rashid, Secretary, Statistics Division of the Government of Bangladesh and formerly of the Court of Wards, was extremely generous with his time and knowledge. Professor Muntasir Mamoon of the University of Dhaka shared with me his enormous store of information on the history of Dhaka. Dr. Binayak Sen and Mrinal Roy spent hours walking with me through the streets of Dhaka. Shireen Hook, Zafrullah Chaudhry, and their wonderful family gave me a home in Bangladesh. It is hard for me to repay my debt to them. I am grateful to the staff of the Oriental and India Office Reading Room of the British Library in London. The bulk of my work there was done in the old reading room on Blackfriars Road before the collection shifted to the new buildings at St. Pancras. I found interesting bits of material in the libraries of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, the University of Chicago, and the Law Library of Columbia University in New York. In Calcutta, I have used the National Library and, as always, the library of the Center for Studies in Social Sciences. Avanti Adhikari was an enthusiastic and enormously reliable research assistant. The late Nirmalaya Acharya was my guide to the mysterious alleys of the College Street Publishing. His untimely death has left a huge void in my life. Gautam Bhadra continues to supply me with nuggets from his inexhaustible fund of historical information. Sila Datya Banerjee, Siddha Bose, Sajeda Momin, and Saugata Roy helped me in various ways. Anjusri Chakrabarti prepared the maps for this book, and M. Iqbal Sheikh edited the scanned photographs for publication. Thanks.